Good afternoon, everybody. I am really excited for our conversation today. I'm so grateful that you all are able to join us. As I'm sure you know, June it's a multi celebration month, right? But June is LGBTQIA plus Pride Month, and so this month, I have panelists joining me and we're going to talk about taking pride in our mental health and talk about mental health care and perinatal mental health in the LGBTQIA plus community. And I'm really excited for our conversation. You see, I have got four people. I'm like, this is going to be good. So y'all hang in there with us. We're going to try to get ourselves limited to the hour, but I think this conversation is really going to be really great. So, again, I'm Andrea Clark-Horton. I'm the director of the Perinatal Mental Health Alliance for People of Color with Postpartum Support International. And we are an organization and a program that bridges the gaps in perinatal mental health services for communities of color. I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves briefly, and I'm going to toss it to one of my PhD classmate, cohort mate, and all of our wonderful person, Tasha Mitchell. You can introduce yourself first, and then we'll go to Brandynicole after that.
All right. Well, I'll introduce myself. My name is Tasha Mitchell. I use she, her pronouns. I am a counselor at a private firm called Relational Insight here in Chicago, where I live. I'm also a doctoral student, like Andrea said, at Garrett, and I have an M.Div as well. So I work as a pastor. Most of my professional experience has been in child and family services over the years. That's been the source of my career. But I have been working right now, working towards my licensure hours, working with clients primarily who are queer, people of color, but I also work as a CPS investigator. So that's where I first got introduced to issues around families, perinatal care, working with a lot of unfortunate circumstances relating to issues with child protective services, but lots of experience there when I lived in Tennessee.
Thank you, Tasha. Dr. Brandynicole.
Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Pride Month to each of you. I'm Dr. Brandynicole Brooks. I am a clinical social worker in the District of Columbia, as well as the state of Virginia. My whole history, same as Tasha, is in child welfare and child and family services. I have been engaged and involved with Postpartum Support International since about 2016, I think, and a part of the Perinatal Mental Health Alliance for POC since its inception. And I am also a perinatal loss doula, so providing support to families who have experienced loss anywhere across the spectrum, and have recently founded an organization here in Virginia, Northern Virginia, called Sleep Sweet Junebug to offer loss support to families who experience a pregnancy or infant loss. So super excited to be here with you all.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Cristina.
Good afternoon, everyone. Cristina Hernandez. I use she, her, pronouns. I am a full spectrum doula. I wear lots of different hats. I'm also a queer parent who's been able to utilize postpartum support during my own needs. And I am the president for Heart and Soul Collective, which is an organization that has been in Las Vegas for a while now, but we are moving towards nonprofit. I'm sure Kaleigh will share a little bit more about that. And during my day job, I am the project manager for a research project here at the School of Public Health at UNLV, working on maternal child health and nutrition and food insecurity. And I'm really excited to be here with you and continue this conversation during Pride Month.
Thank you. And last but not least, welcome back, Kaleigh.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm in great company as always. My name is Kaleigh Mancha. I use pronouns she, her. I'm a queer identified Latina who also wears multiple hats, as many of us do. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in private practice. I've done a lot of work between nonprofit, educational institutions, and for the past 7 years, private practice. I'm also the co-founder of Heart and Soul Collective, which is a BIPOC created and led nonprofit in Las Vegas that aims to reduce maternal child health disparities disparities and access to resources. And then I'm also a full spectrum doula that offers care from preconception through loss, abortion, labor, and postpartum. So definitely involved in trying to destigmatize mental health within different communities, particularly communities of color and queer communities.
Thank you. Thanks, Kaleigh. All right, so let's jump into it because I've got a lot of questions, and I think that with the diverse backgrounds that we have here, like this is going to be a great conversation. So I'm gonna toss it to Tasha first. Tasha, what biases do you think that queer families, queer parents, and birthing people face in the healthcare and mental health care system?
Yeah, I can personalize this a little bit. So one of the things that I have said personally for me after working as a therapist and then having a lot of friends who are now going through the process of birthing and getting pregnant, like I have told people, like I will not personally have children with a partner unless we are married. One of the biggest anxieties for me, and I think one of the biggest fears and challenges that we face, is having to deal with legitimacy of like, are we going to be recognized, especially in the national narrative right now? If you had asked me 5 years ago, I might I might not have said anything, right? I might not have thought about it because I thought we were trending in a different direction. But I think now those fears are getting stoked and they're much more significant. You know, I could be fine in Illinois, right? Have a partner, not be married, have a child, not think about it, and then travel back to Tennessee where I used to live. And now the conversation is different, right? So thinking about, for me, it really comes down to one of my biggest fears is like legitimacy of like our family, legitimacy of our children, even how that will be received in our family, right? Like that's not really your child, right? And how, and the questions that come along with that. Well, how, you know, how did you go about it? People are always wanting to ask questions to determine whether or not the way that you have built your family and your life is legitimate in their eyes, or in their laws, right? And so I know for me, and like I said, a lot of the people that I work with, I have a client right now who is queer and is pregnant. Yeah, there's just a lot of fears around it. Like, how are we going to be perceived in public, and by our families and by the institutions around us? And will those institutions, those supports, our families really protect and support us as a unit? Or are they going to be dismissive, and are there going to be legal challenges, right? If I travel to another state and my child gets sick and my spouse has to go, but the state is like, well, we don't honor that here or whatever. You know what I mean? Like these are things that people don't think about when you're in a heteronormative, heterosexual relationship. Even if you're not married, you don't have to think about these things, right? Because there are other protections. So that's probably one of the highest ones on my list when I think about this.
Kaleigh, anything else to add, or and how does that affect how queer families or queer parents seek mental health care?
Yeah, I was going to say for me, it's about accessing resources. So, do I have financial resources to build my family in the way that I want to build it? Does my community have resources that are safe? So, on my website, I advertise that I'm queer identified because for me, in looking for a provider, I want to make sure that all of my identities are affirmed
Yeah.
and that my identities don't exclude me from the care that others might receive. And so being really transparent about our intersectional identities as providers in creating a space that is welcoming so that we go beyond the language of this is a safe, inclusive space for insert vulnerable community here, but more, I have lived experience. And so I may not have the same lived experience as you, but I have the context in which you navigate the world. And you don't have to explain your identity to me. That's not, if you're coming to therapy because you're experiencing postpartum depression, you don't also have to explain your queerness.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Cristina, does any of this resonate with you?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, I had an experience. So my partner and I did IVF and we had an early loss. And I remember we ended up going to the fertility clinic because that's just where we went. And just, I was grateful that the staff there were as aware to be able to not only check in on me, but also check in on my partner and see like, how are they doing? How are they feeling about this loss in the immediate, but then afterwards as well, kind of continually checking in. And I think if we think about reproductive care spaces, most of them are very centered heterosexual, very centered in feminine identities. And so if we think about trans and non-binary folks, like those aren't always spaces that they feel comfortable in. And like I said, it's always, even when we think about asking for support, that's such a vulnerable space to be. And if you feel like you have to educate someone about your family or your fears, especially right now, like Tasha, I think that that really resonated with me. Is, you know, when we were having children, it was 2014, so we were still, you know, not fully accepted. But I think, like, thinking about now parenthood and the legitimacy of our families, there's a lot more to think about. Like, we are married, but my partner doesn't have a second parent adoption. And so thinking about, you know, if we were to get divorced, or if we were to move to another state where our, you know, our family was not accepted, like what would that look like if something were to happen to me? So I definitely think that those are all issues that are consistent and are even getting worse now because of the climate that we're in.
Yeah. And Dr. Brandynicole, as somebody who works like both as a volunteer for PSI, I know you facilitate our LGBTQIA support group, right?
Yes.
But also someone who works with queer folks and queer families on a regular basis. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Does it resonate with you?
Certainly, it's all very familiar, especially to Tasha's point around the legitimate nature of family, but also thinking about the level of respect that queer families are not given. So, even in the midst of things like titles and just coming in and automatically assuming that the birthing person is mom or wants to be called mom,
Right.
or you know, not having a title for partner at all and not really including them in the conversation. So it's also not only the legitimate nature of it, but also the respect and just the inclusion side of including, if both partners are there and both parents are there, having them both included in the conversation and not just talking to the birthing person and labeling the birthing person as mom, and using, you know, the terms that are what we have talked about and what we've shared with the community, especially in the midst of either doula services or medical support, and even in loss circumstances. I myself, as a lesbian woman, experienced a loss very early on as well. And just not having the respect of anyone even considering that I had a partner that also need to be checked on. So hearing Christina's story, I appreciate that organization, and, you know, shout them out because this doesn't happen often. That we are, you know, fully seen as a family, and that there are two adults that are engaged and involved in the experience.
Yeah. So how does that? I can imagine the thing that that keeps coming to my mind is, as a person who lives with an anxiety disorder, that I do, right? Um, how does this affect like levels of anxiety? Like when you're going in, you need support because something is happening with your child, or with the child that you're pregnant with, or your partner's child. Right? Like, how does anxiety like look? I could imagine this would heighten anxiety. And do, okay, I don't want you all to speak for all queer people because we don't do that here. But I can imagine that as because as a black woman, like going into healthcare spaces, I automatically, like, my guard is up a little bit, right? Because of our history with the medical system. And I know that black women are still not being listened to when they talk about things happening in their own bodies. It's always our imagination, right? Or we can take more pain. Um, so I'm just wondering if any of you have worked with your clients around the anxiety that comes up when having to engage with these systems, and what does that look like? Like, what is that? How does that show up? So in case there's somebody who's watching that's wondering, like, am I abnormal because I don't like going to the doctor, I don't like taking my kid for the checkup, or I don't like going for my pre because, and I don't quite know why. Can you speak to like what that anxiety looks like? Tasha, Kaleigh, somebody jump in. I know you.
Yeah, I mean, I think your question really speaks to what it looks like for me as a doula with a mental health background. So I attract a lot of clients who know that I specialize in perinatal mood and anxiety disorders and complex trauma. And so what that looks like in birthing spaces is paralysis sometimes, where an individual doesn't feel like their voice is heard or valued, and so they're unable to make decisions. That can also look like, maybe from the provider perspective, as argumentative, non-compliant, when really it's the person trying to get more information about what's happening to them or around them or with them. And so oftentimes I find providers perceiving clients with high anxiety as difficult. In reality, what's most helpful is to validate that the anxiety is present and that it's rooted in something valid. From a systemic lens, we all have layers of identities and certain levels of privilege or disadvantage. And so when we acknowledge that we're not coming into the system equally with all the same privilege, I think that really normalizes. You're not weird, you're not crazy for having these fears, because they're rooted in some truth. They're rooted in someone's experience. And so how do we prevent these from escalating to become harm or trauma? And I think when we minimize that anxiety as being ridiculous, then people cling to it even tighter because it's protection. And so acknowledging that there is a desire for safety, and how do we create safety in the room, and what does that look like for that person? And maybe that's slowing things down. Maybe that's more information, but we have to address that it's present and that it's there for a reason.
And in my experience, I've also seen in families where the birthing person has a high level of anxiety just about being there and being fully present, is that a lot of times it can also look like just over compliance. So because there's silence, it's seen as, oh, this is fine that we do this. When you really take a look at kind of the history of the individual, and you're thinking about kind of how their reactions were in like office visits and things of that nature, you recognize, no, this is not something they want. And so we need to have, like Kaleigh said, we need to slow down and we need to have more conversation. And even as a doula in those moments, because it's about empowering the birthing person, I'm having conversations directly with the birthing person to say, is this something that you want? Is this how you feel right now in this moment? What more information do you need? Because we built that relationship that they may not have built with, the provider that just came from the practice that they've never met before, and now that person's delivering their baby. So being able to kind of slow down the conversation and empowering the birthing person to have a voice in the space, I think is also helpful.
Tasha, anything?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. So, with my client right now, who is currently navigating the medical system with their pregnancy, a lot of the anxiety has centered upon not being heard and understood, and not feeling like what Kaleigh was saying, the feelings are validated. So, my client is kind of going through something where trying to advocate for herself, and not feeling like the medical professionals on her team are actually like responding and legitimizing her fears and her concerns and answering questions. It's just kind of like, well, we're the experts, just trust us. And she's like, I have questions. And so I'm actually really grateful my client has a doula, and I advocated for this. And so we have processed this in our sessions, right? Like, what is your doula saying about this? And like trying to use that to validate, like, no, you do have a sense of agency, you do have a voice, you do have multiple people who are supporting you, have a partner who supports you. So really trying to edify them, validate their feelings, because their feelings are valid, regardless of how we process the situation and what the steps we take moving forward. The feelings are always valid. How you feel is valid, right? What you do with those feelings is different. That's different upon person. But yeah, really making sure that they feel seen and heard, at least in the therapeutic setting, right? Like, my job always is to make sure that my clients feel seen and heard, known and understood. So regardless, I want to make sure that is a space where they can come to me, and that they can at least have a place to process those anxieties, because in the systems that they're in, they're not being heard. So I'm like, we're going to work on that here to make sure that you are heard, and then we're going to plan, a course of action from there.
Yeah. Thanks, Tasha. I think one of the things that I just had, it was kind of a mini aha a little bit ago when Tasha was talking about the fear of your family not receiving this benefit of being considered legitimate, right, as a queer family. Like, it's something, because that's that was a privilege smack to me because, right, I'm a heterosexual woman and I don't have to think about whether or not people are going to think of my family composition as legitimate. And so so now that's one of the things that I understand might create a little bit of anxiety or be a little bit of a trigger. Um, Not being able, certainly that not having your voice heard is something that resonates with me as a woman of color. But what are some other things that people fail to realize, like can be triggers or can be things that may cause queer folks to um, have heightened levels of anxiety or heightened levels of emotional response um, with regard to their pregnancy or postpartum concerns. I don't know, Cristina, you have any thoughts on that?
Well, talking about the previous question, one of the things that I wanted to bring up is that we're really resourceful, right? So thinking about, we talk to each other, like who are the affirming, inclusive providers out there? You know, where are the places that I should go? Where should I stay away from? And so I know, like, for a lot of the folks that I've worked with, it's really, you know, for me to get that information, like, hey, here's a list of providers, of course, like interview them and check them out and see who feels good to you. So that way we can try to minimize as much as we can that harm that could be caused and that anxiety about, like, okay, I mean, they still might not have a good experience because who may work for me may not work for you. But really thinking about like those spaces that have been created that are safer for individuals who are queer, trans, or non-binary. I think for, you know, that respect Brandynicole was talking about is really important when we think about pronouns. My spouse is non-binary, so even when we think about going into, you know, when they take our kids to the doctor, you know, how are they going to refer to them? Paperwork, intakes, all the time having to scratch out dad or father. Even, you know, at the hospital, I remember the nurse calling my partner my husband, and it was like super confusing. At the time, they identified as a woman, and I was like, okay, definitely not my husband. But I think those are some of the triggers that, you know, that how are they going to refer to me? Are they going to use the correct pronoun? Those are really big issues. And even when we think about someone's body and the way that they relate to their body, you know, even in the birthing space, like how many people are in the room, who needs to be there, who doesn't need to be there, you know, all of those little things that, you know, as a doula, I can work with my clients of figuring out, like, I was an anti-violence advocate for a really long time. So I incorporate some of that safety planning into the birth space and thinking about, you know, if there are triggers that may come up, like how do we try to minimize those or try to plan for some of that so that we can eliminate them before we get into the birth space. But even if we are in the birth space, to having some of that safety planning in place so that we know, you know, as the doula or as the partner, like, okay, these are some things that we should be looking out for and trying to prevent in those spaces.
I love that safety planning. Like, I mean, I think that I'm a big advocate of a birth plan anyway, right? But I love that safety planning. Tasha, you look like you had something to add.
Oh,
Did you?
somebody else? I saw somebody else on mute. Did you unmute? I think a couple people.
I did. I was
just
yeah, I was just thinking about it from the family perspective and the legitimacy and the respect and all of that. And oftentimes I think what it can be activating is the questions that come that are not from a place of genuine concern, but that are more so of kind of putting life on display. And so asking the very intimate personal questions about, you know, donors or how the baby get here and things of that nature can absolutely be triggering, especially if you're coming from a family, from my experience as a Black woman raised in a Southern, very religious family. questions about science being involved in the conception and development of a baby. And so that can also be triggering or activating for some families, is just having to have those conversations and defending the fact that, you know, this is still my baby and our child, and this child is part of the family and part of our legacy. That can also be a challenge, especially for queer people of color, and just, you know, having that open conversation that is full of questions that you really don't want to answer, but you almost feel like you have to because of the level of respect that you have for your elders, and, you know, all of those things.
I got some stuff I want to ask about that. Tasha, did you want to follow up?
No, that's exactly what I was going to talk about, like the intimate questions that people tend to ask. Generally, being a queer person, you always get asked really intimate questions. So I'm thinking, like, not even being someone who is pregnant right now or planning to get pregnant anytime soon, still this idea of, like, if I'm with somebody, the questions that come up of, like, well, who's the woman in their relationship, and who's the man? Well, who's the more masculine one? Like, who does, you know, these things? People really, I think sometimes there is curiosity, but sometimes it's just nosy and it's offensive. But regardless of how we feel about planning families, I think most queer people have to deal with this in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, being mindful of how we ask questions and being mindful of whether people are engaging us in conversations to even lay a foundation to ask questions. I think that is a different level of intimacy. If we're in a conversation and it's going there, I don't mind people asking questions, but trying to, like, trigger those questions or, like, get that information when the person that you're talking to isn't necessarily just offering that up, probably not a good idea to just go in and be like, well, they haven't actually mentioned this, but I'm curious, so I want to ask them the questions that I'm just curious about. Queer folks have to deal with this all of the time. There's all kinds of questions that pop up that people want to know. Sometimes I understand where it's coming from, but sometimes it's just really inappropriate. It can be very, very, very triggering, especially when you've had to answer questions over and over and over again. Certain things just are not that important for other people to know. And so, yeah, just being really, really mindful of, like, how we ask questions, when we ask questions, and are the questions actually, like, solicited, or are we just kind of interjecting because we're really curious and we want to know, we're nosy, or, you know, there is some ulterior motive. Thinking also too, like, paying attention without necessarily speaking up and asking questions. So for example, I have two family members who have a child and they're queer. And I started noticing this last time that I was home, that their daughter started referring to one of them in more masculine pronouns, but none of the other family members are catching on to this. And so, like, just kind of like, I'm primed to this. So I'm like, okay, there's something going on here that's changing and transitioning in this relationship, but nobody else has picked up on this, right? And so it's created kind of this point of contention, because it's like, oh, well, you know, so-and-so's mom. And I'm like, maybe we should choose these words a little bit more, with a little bit more care and concern. Yeah, that's what I was going to offer to that conversation.
Thanks,
I just want to wrap this question up by saying, from a historical perspective, queer presentation, our identities shift over time. So we make a lot of space for the transition from being someone without a child to being a mother, and motherhood journey. Language is really feminine. We welcome that transition, and we don't do a really good job societally of recognizing that queer people come into self-expression differently due to political climates or cultural climates, historical experiences. And so it can be really triggering to accept somebody as the way they presented once, and then to really struggle to accept their transition in identity, whether that is pronouns, preferences, or I have a lot of folks that will come out later in life due to their family background. And so not being seen in that identity that they want to be seen in, getting pushback for the way that they want to, because we don't know who we're going to be before we become a parent. And so just creating some space for people to work through maybe generational trauma, family trauma, to embrace their journey on their own without feedback on how it should look.
Yeah, that's great. I was wondering, as both as you were, well, as everybody kind of was talking, um, But Brandy, I think you kind of hit on this directly first about your own like cultural background, like your own heritage, right? So um, I know that as a Black Christian woman, that we have a long way to go um, in our kind of church spaces and in our cultural spaces in terms of being open, affirming, and accepting of people who identify as queer. Heck, we had a whole denomination yesterday expelled churches because they call women pastors. Um, that was a white denomination, but still, we have a lot of like black and other black and brown churches that kind of model themselves after and adopt these ideologies and the doctrinal beliefs of those more fundamentalist and conservative kind of even white evangelical spaces, right? And so, how Tasha, you brought up an example of like a couple in your family that's parenting a child, right? But how do intra cultural biases, intracultural, like within your own kind of racial and ethnic cultural group, how does that affect how um, you how can that affect queer folks mental health, especially as they're coming into this shift in identity as parents? Like what kind of barriers are there? I don't know. Brandy, did you want to talk about that first?
Well, I want to first say that that the church has come a long way. We're not quite there yet, but there are some things that have happened, and we've come a long way. However, I think that the impact is not leaning into the spaces where we typically lean into for support.
Mm-hmm.
So, being raised in a Black church, you are taught, you are socialized to, you lean into your church family when you need support for whatever that looks like, whether it be prayer, whether it be guidance, whether it be tangible resources. And when it comes to a space where they're not inclusive, and you've heard the fire and brimstone from the pulpit around your queer LGBTQIA plus identity, then you don't have that space to lean into any longer. And so now it's about creating a chosen family and creating the safe space. And so the emotional labor that it takes to create another family outside of the family that you have been like socialized into. Um, and that, in and of itself is going to impact our mental health. It's going to impact our even physical health, and just the interpersonal relationships and what those look like and what they mean to us and how we cling or don't cling to them. And just finding a space and a place to fit in.
Yeah. Cristina, you have any thoughts about that? Whether it be about the religious aspect or even in your own like cultural heritage, cultural space.
Yeah, I was born and raised Catholic, but very early on at age 13, kind of pushed back on that. And then even coming out to my mom, I came out later in life. So I was about 25 when I came out, and hearing that, which I will say my mother has grown a lot in the last like 17 years. But I remember coming out to her and just that shame, your family will never be recognized, you're going to hell, that rhetoric. Though I will say now, I have nieces and nephews who are coming out, and the ideas, the tone is very different, which I'm super grateful for. Even if I had to get the brunt of that beginning process. But I think that is really harmful, especially if you are a person who really leans into religion or spirituality and you're being rejected by that community. That could be really difficult. But again, chosen family and creating these spaces of resistance, creating like, what is spirituality or religion mean to me in the way that I want to see it or I want to feel supported. I think we're really good at creating our own things to be a space where we can still use some of the things that we grew up with. We may not use everything that we were taught, or but understanding that like we can create what that means for us as a community, and even just personally, that's the way that I've seen it, where I've rejected Catholicism, but I am a spiritual person and no one can take that away from you.
Right. Right. Kaleigh, any thoughts before I let Tasha jump in? Because I know Tasha's ready to go. I know Tasha's ready to go. Pastor Tasha.
I got some thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
I think in therapy, what I talk a lot about is deconstructing our internalized voice. What part is us and what part is what we've collected.
Yes, yes.
And so religion and spirituality is, for some folks, our first experience with the formation of values. So even if you end up leaving the church or being kicked out of the church, you've internalized belief systems that have to be deconstructed as you begin to create your life. And so, Cristina brought up a great point of no one can take away what you create for yourself. And also there's a lot of work that goes into that process that requires community support. It's a community process, because just as you collected a narrative, you have to collect a new one. You have to be able to challenge it and be affirmed in it. So, part of the barrier is once you've left a formed community, how do you find the next community that's going to receive you so that you can do the work you need to do to build the person that you are?
Yes, yes. Okay, Tasha.
This is where the academic in me comes out. I'm sitting here looking at this book, and Andrea, you might appreciate this, but this is taking me back to sitting here looking at it. A Womanist Pastoral Theology Against Intimate Cultural Violence by Stephanie Crumpton. So it's taking me back. I don't know if y'all have read this book, but thinking about one of the big takeaways from that was that oftentimes, especially when we talk about queer families, but any family that has an intersectional identity, right? Oftentimes, the same people that cause harm are the same sources of support. And so it's not just simple to be like, well, get rid of those people out of your life. Stop going to that church. That's not really helpful. And just being sensitive to the fact that those answers aren't always the answer that is most suitable for the family or the couple. And that's not always realistic. But then also just noticing and acknowledging the nuance in that experience. Like, the people who harm me are the people who I love and who I have to rely on for support, because some people don't have support outside of those spaces, right? So when you talk about like intracultural bias, it's going to show up. It shows up in our religious systems. It shows up in our race and ethnic identities, like all these different spaces where we cherish these spaces, we value these spaces, we turn to these spaces for support. And then these spaces will be the same places where we are harmed. And there is a dichotomy in that, and there's a nuance in that I think people just don't pay attention to and are sometimes insensitive to, right? So for example, I can offer a personal example. Somebody in my family recently made a derogatory comment about queer folk, a specific queer person. And I think they meant it as a joke. And I was like, you can't say things like that. So even though I know where this person sits in relation to me coming out and my own identity, they still were in a place to like harm me based on something they said about somebody else. I didn't even think that it would resonate with me. And I was taken aback by that. So it's like, I love this person. I want to be in a relationship with this person, but I also recognize that this person has the capacity to harm me. And this is something that queer folks especially have to go through over and over and over again. The spaces that harm us are oftentimes the spaces that we have to turn to for support. And we can't just pull those two pieces apart. So being sensitive to that is really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's wow. Hadn't thought about that way. But what I was thinking about as you all were commenting is about this concept of allyship, right? And so I think a lot about this in relationship to folks of color and people who are not folks of color, and what definitions of good allyship, what a good ally looks like, right? Um, and so, because it kind of feels like, and sometimes what we do, even as straight folks of color, is we'll do what it kind of sounds like that family member did. Like, well, I love, like, I got a gay cousin, so I can't be like homophobic. And so like I got a queer cousin, I got a queer friend, my brother is queer, my sister is trans, or whatever the case may be. So I can't be, but what does real allyship look like? Like if if you guys could uh, give your own personal definitions, like your own thoughts about it. Like, what does real allyship look like between um, heterosexual, straight folks of color and queer folks of color? Like, what does it mean for me to be your ally? And thinking about that, even in terms of systems that are biased against us for a variety of reasons, like what does my allyship look like in the healthcare space? What does my allyship to you look like in the child welfare space? Like, anybody jump in.
I know, Tasha, you want to go? I saw you. Okay. I want to speak to a personal example of allyship, and I know my mom's going to watch this because she watches all my stuff. I didn't come out to my mom till I was 30, when I was ready to bring my female identified partner home for Thanksgiving. And at the time, my daughter was 8. So my parents assumed that I was heterosexual. They'd only seen me in a relationship with men. And so I remember being really nervous because I grew up in a Mexican family that was on my dad's side. We don't have gay people here. And then, my mom's side, we didn't talk about that. So, and even though I've had gay friends, I didn't know how it would be if I came out. And so my mom said, well, I just want you to be in a relationship with someone who cares about you and respects you. I just want you to be loved. And it was, I can feel the breath that I took when I said that. Then fast forward a few years later, and my daughter came out to me. And I remember sitting in my head, like, do I tell her? Because I hadn't expressed to her my queer identity outwardly. And the allyship piece was, for me, with my mom representing that, she was curious. So she didn't dismiss my child, but she was like, hey, Kaleigh, how can she know that? She's still so young. My daughter was 10. And I'm like, well, how did you know that? How did you know that you wanted to date men? And my daughter is really vocal about her queer identity. And sometimes it makes me really uncomfortable. She's like, oh, I watched this queer anime, and she's going on and on about this love triangle. And I know if it makes me uncomfortable because I wasn't outwardly expressive in my journey originally at her age, that it makes my mom uncomfortable. But my mom will listen. She'll ask questions. She's invested. And even if she doesn't quite understand anime or, still has a lot of questions, she is open to listening. She's engaged, involved. It's important to her. And so I think making somebody feel important, having them feel heard. I mean, Tasha, it's everything you said about therapy. Being an ally is creating space for someone to explore, creating space for someone to also be curious in their journey, and saying, I love you regardless, and I just want you to be loved and returned.
I love it. I love it. Tasha, did you have thoughts?
Yeah, just thinking about allyship, being someone who has multiple intersectional identities, I find myself in ally spaces even though I have intersectional identities. So being a pastor, being someone who is biracial, who has a Black parent and a white parent, sometimes that means advocating for Black friends in white spaces that I know how to navigate, right? Like, we all know how to do this. And I think some of the things that I think about, one thing in particular, is using the privilege and the space of privilege that you do have to advocate for other people. Because some people are like, well, I don't want to have much of a personal cost. Like, how can I do something that doesn't actually cost me anything? That's not allyship, right? That's performative or something else. It's not true allyship until I'm willing to take some resource that I have and actually invest it, and there's some personal cost to me. I don't look at that as allyship. So taking all that I have, right? Maybe that means having a hard conversation with somebody that I know another person who's triggered cannot, right? Maybe it means calling out a family member when I know the person who was harmed won't do that and will never say anything, right? yeah, sitting in spaces where you're actually using the resources and the privilege available to you to do positive work for the people who may not have the resources, who may not have the privilege, who may not have the voice, and may not, be even in a mental state, a mental health state, to be able to advocate for themselves. Like sometimes we do have to step in and be defenders for people. This is where I'm going to start preaching. The pastor is going to come out of me, right? Like actually defending those who can't defend themselves. These are biblical things from my perspective. Like allyship would be a biblical principle for people who are religious. When I think about Jesus, like Jesus didn't call us to just kind of like pull back and be like, I'm just going to ride this wave and I'm going to sit this one out. Like, no, we have to go into the trenches and be willing to do that. If our default is, well, I don't want to give up anything, then I'd be like, well, sit the allyship out. This isn't for you.
This is not what you do then. This is not what you do.
Right.
Cristina, what does allyship mean to you?
Yeah, I was thinking about, when we think about when we're not in the room and when someone says something, to me, that speaks more to that allyship, because a lot of things that we see, whether it's on social media or people talking in front of you, it's sometimes performative. But if I'm not in the room and someone's talking about my family or my child, like, how are you responding to that? Like, that shows, even though I may not ever know that you did that, but that to me is allyship. And to Tasha's point and about privilege, I hold a lot of privilege. Like, my skin is white. Most people think I'm heterosexual. I'm cisgender. So like using some of that privilege when I do have access to some of those spaces to integrate, like, how are we including trans people? How are we talking about non-binary people? Especially in the reproductive justice movement, is really crucial to me as an ally to that community, even though I am a part of the LGBTQ community, but I hold privilege in being cisgender. And so really trying to integrate what I know, from working with clients or like my own family members, to make sure that they are included in that conversation in reproductive care, reproductive justice spaces. So to me, that's a bit of what allyship looks like.
Yep, I agree with that. Anything to add, Dr. Brandynicole?
I mean, I'm going to echo what everyone else said, but I think the only other piece that I would add for myself personally, when I think about an ally for me, is someone who is giving me the space to be psychologically safe. And so really thinking about, it's not just about what are you doing to kind of defend on my behalf, whether I be in the space or not, or I'm not in a space where I can speak up for myself, but also providing that level of kind of emotional and psychological safety where I can be fully who I am when I'm with you, and I can talk to you about things. And it's a conversation, is if I'm talking about my wife, you're hearing me and giving me feedback just as if I were talking about my husband. So in that way, that kind of feels like allyship is holding space for me that is psychologically safe. I've been talking about psychological safety at work for like the last 6 months. And so that's always stands out for me, is what are we doing to support people's psychological safety? And it's not just about me feeling psychologically safe, but what am I doing that's impeding your psychological safety? And what do I need to do differently so that you feel psychologically safe in my presence, but also in this organization, in this hospital, in this, medical office, or as your doula, am I providing psychological safety? All of those things.
In this classroom,
yes,
all of that. Tasha, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, as you were talking, it just made me think about emotional labor. And so one of the things that I think about with allies, in my process of becoming an ally, it requires the emotional labor of the people that I'm trying to be an ally for, then this process is not going according to plan, right? So, for example, not requiring the people that I'm trying to be an ally for to educate me. Now, there is some nuance to that, right? Like, I should do my own work, but I should also recognize that the individual experience is just that individual. And so sometimes I may need to get further information and not just assume that the experience is across the board. And so, yeah, recognizing that, but I shouldn't be growing in my allyship by climbing on the backs of the people that I'm actually trying to advocate for, right? And so if my allyship causes other people to push forth more emotional labor than it's worth, like, that's not appropriate either. And so I have to really think about, am I doing the work as an ally for myself? Am I educating myself? Am I navigating this in a way that doesn't require the people that I'm supporting to do more work for me?
Yeah, I love that, because I was just getting ready to ask you that, because when I think about allyship, I think about um, first recognizing where you enjoy privilege, right? And then second, how are you stewarding that privilege, right? And I think that that can be extended to all of the things that you all were saying. But then the third piece for me that becomes like tricky, and it harkens back to something you said a little bit earlier, Tasha, about like asking questions and like trying to figure out, whether or not this is a good time or good space or good way to indulge my curiosity. Am I indulging my curiosity? Am I really trying to learn? And then how much of that do you put on, the person who with whom you enjoy some difference, right? I think about this, to make a parallel. Just at the hospital I used to work for, right around the time when all the stuff with George Floyd happened, right? They, the hospital administration, who had just started a diversity program, like diversity office. Please don't. This is why I don't work there no more. Because it's a huge hospital system, and in 2020 you just launching a diversity office anyway. Reached out to the Black employees group and say, what are some things that we can read, and so the chair of the Black employees group was saying they want us to give them a list of books and resources and stuff like that. And I said, tell them I'm tired. I don't want to give you anything. Like, figure it out, right? Google, do something. But then we know that the tendency, because folks, we tend to make shortcuts, right? Bias is all about how we make these mental, intellectual, like, shortcuts in order to make things easier for us. And so, like you said, the danger in balancing, like, okay, I don't want to put all the work on this person who's a member of this group. I want to do some of my own work, but then I don't know, like, how much of that Google stuff and the books that I read and the movies that I watch, like, how much can I assume that I understand by just doing that?
That's a great point. And what you're talking about is consent-based interactions. So, if somebody is curious and they want a resource and I have the capacity to give it, then I give it. And afterwards, if they have questions and I don't have the capacity, then, I hope that I've cultivated consent-based interactions in my relationships enough so that an individual would recognize that is, again, back to Tasha's point, an emotional labor. So curiosity isn't the problem. It's lacking the inquisitiveness around, do you have the capacity for that? Do you have the desire for that? And honoring that when you live in intersectional identities, whether we're talking about race and ethnicity, queerness, neurodivergence, it's already extra work to live in those identities because we have marginalized them, we have stigmatized them. And so just living everyday lives is hard. So if we use consent, then an individual can contextualize what we're curious about or what we're learning about, or maybe they redirect us somewhere else. And so I think if we approach it with respect, then there's an opportunity to learn about the question you're curious about, or an opportunity to learn what consent feels like.
Perfect. Thank you. Love that. Tasha snapping. She likes that too. Brandynicole or Cristina, any other thoughts about that?
Well, as you were talking, Andrea, I was just thinking about, the emotional labor side of it and the inquisitiveness, and is it a genuine question? And just thinking about all of the labor for us just sitting here thinking about it. Right. And now imagine someone navigating a medical system or a mental health system as a pregnant person who may be experiencing complications, who is experiencing anxiety of just showing up and having their family, feel legitimate, in air quotes, or feeling like they're not going to be respected. It's a lot to process and think about. And so as an ally, it's about hearing conversations like this and kind of taking it in and recognizing, that is a lot. And it's not anything that I may have to deal with, but that's a lot. And how can I approach this in a way that is, one that is caring and compassionate and empathetic? And even though I may feel like I need to ask these questions, really taking a check of myself. Do I really need to know that right now in this moment? Or do I just need to really help her, help the birthing person count their breaths at this moment? Or is it that I need to be asking all of these more in-depth, detailed questions?
Yep. Cristina, anything else you wanted to add?
I think we kind of covered it all, but I definitely think that that it is really about doing your own work. And I love the idea about like consent. I think it's like, how does someone approach it? Are they being authentic? Or is it exploitive, right? Like asking those questions because I'm just curious and I just want to know, or does it help the process? If we're talking about like a birthing person, maybe in a polyamorous relationship where we're needing to know a little bit more about something, like that may be okay. Depending on how that person is asking those questions and what their intent behind the questions are. But a lot of it is like that own, like, how have you done the work to really show up right now?
Right.
If I can, the consent-based piece just really is sticking out for me. So I thank you, Kaleigh, for saying it. But it's even in like relationships and friendships, it's about asking for consent. Like, do you have the bandwidth on top of all the other stuff that you're dealing with in your life? Do you have the bandwidth to deal with mine stuff too, to kind of give me some feedback? And so that's not just in, these spaces where we're talking about this really hard emotional stuff, but just in general, just being a person who practices that. And then it becomes easy and second nature for you to ask for the consent of the additional labor that you're putting on the person of color or, any marginalized individual. So if we're practicing it in our day to day and it's becoming part of our just fabric of who we are, then it's not an extra step. It's not, something about wokeness. It's just about, this is just, something that's compassionate and empathetic to be able to ask someone, do you have the bandwidth to take on this additional labor that I'm asking you for?
Right. And I think also, as a person who's trying to become a better ally, like every day, is also when somebody tells you the answer to that question is no, or like when they say, what are you trying to ask? Like, that's really not an appropriate question that you're asking me, or what's behind, like, not jumping to the defense or becoming offended by that, right? Like, you gotta eat that. So, but I think first and foremost, you gotta learn how to read the room. Like you were saying, Dr. Brandynicole, like, is this the appropriate time to be asking this particular question? And recognizing that it is going to that, like it with anything, that there are times when you're going to have to build trust, right? And you can't assume that trust all the time, or can't assume that someone is going to trust you just because you say, I'm an ally and I believe, like, love is love and everybody is, we're all children of God, however you put it, right? Like, not assuming that you have somebody's trust right out the gate just because that's, your life mantra or whatever the case may be, right? And so we're running close to time, and I knew we were going to, and I knew this was going to be a phenomenal conversation. I want to thank all of my guests, Dr. Brandynicole, Cristina Hernandez, Kaleigh Mancha, Tasha Mitchell. Thank you all so much. Thank you for your input, for your vulnerability, for your just like this awesome conversation. I want to talk to those of you who are watching and you feel like you are in need of some support. You're either pregnant or just postpartum and you're not quite feeling like yourself, or you are the partner, spouse, family member, loved one, friend of someone, and you don't know how to help that person. You see that our PSI helpline, the number is scrolling at the bottom. We have folks who are there to help you in English, Spanish. If you need Spanish, the Maternal Mental Health Hotline, the number is scrolling there at the bottom. And those are all trained counselors on the maternal mental health hotline. And yes, we are culturally humble and culturally aware. And so you need not worry that there are going to be people that pick up that phone that are not going to be sensitive to um, the intersections of your identity, right? We have people that are trained and that who also have lived experiences, right, that come from a variety of backgrounds, right? So please, if you feel like you're struggling, pick up the phone and call, and then they'll be able to direct you to more local resources if you need it. If you're in crisis and you feel as though you may not know if you want to live, if you feel like you want to take your own life, we don't want you to do that. Just dial these three numbers for the crisis line 988, and someone is going to be there. These are all 24/7. So there's somebody is always there. Okay. All right. We want you to know that you are not alone, that you are not invisible, that you are seen, that you are heard, and that we are here and that you're going to be okay. You will be okay. But healing starts with help. So give us a call if you need, or go to postpartum.net and you can look for our resources there. Okay. Thank you to my guests again. Happy Pride to you all, and happy Pride to those of you watching. All right. Until next month, thank you so much. Bye bye.